Welcome to an HDRN Pragmatic Trials Training Program educational module.
This is the third and final part of our series on developing pragmatic trial protocols using the Spirit 2025 checklist.
In the first two modules, we covered Spirit items 1 to 26, including administrative information, open science practices, the introduction, and methods related to participants, interventions, and outcomes. We also covered the items that make a trial operational: recruitment, randomization and allocation concealment, blinding decisions in pragmatic settings, and how data are collected, managed, and followed over time.
This module covers the statistical components, including sample size and what a credible statistical analysis plan looks like. Then we move to trial oversight, like monitoring, interim analyses, reporting of harms, and stopping guidelines, with a pragmatic lens for low-risk real-world trials. Finally, we wrap up with ethics, consent, including waivers or alterations, confidentiality, protocol amendments, and post-trial considerations.
In the last module, we intentionally skipped Spirit item 19, so we could cover it here alongside the rest of the statistical methods. The protocol must explain how the required sample size was determined, including the method, key assumptions, and all inputs. That includes the expected outcome rate in the control group, with source or rationale, the clinically relevant effect size, power, alpha, and any adjustments for dropout or loss to follow up. If it's a cluster trial, you should also report the intra-cluster correlation coefficient, the expected average cluster size, and how you'll handle variability in cluster size, the resulting design effect, and whether you applied any small sample correction for the number of clusters. If you're using unequal allocation, stratification, or repeated measures, those design features should be reflected in the calculation as well.
Now we move to Spirit item 27 on statistical methods. It starts with 27A, which covers how you'll analyze the primary and secondary outcomes. For the primary outcome, name the model or test for the group comparison. For example, we will use linear regression to compare mean change in blood pressure between groups, adjusting for baseline blood pressure. The approach should match the outcome type and the trial design, including cluster versus individual randomization.
Also state the significance level and any covariates included by design, with a brief rationale. If you plan both adjusted and unadjusted analyses, specify which is primary. If there's clustering or repeated measures, say how you'll account for it, for example using mixed effects models or GEE with appropriate cluster adjustment. For secondary outcomes, you can be less detailed, but still clear about the analytic approach. And if you have a separate statistical analysis plan, reference it.
Then, item 27B, definition of who will be included in each analysis. In superiority trials, most pragmatic trials use an intention-to-treat approach, meaning all participants are analyzed as randomized, regardless of adherence. If the design is non-inferiority or equivalence, be explicit about the primary analysis set and whether both intention-to-treat and per-protocol analyses will be reported. If there will be any per-protocol or as-treated analyses, describe them as secondary. If any participants are excluded from analyses, define that up front. For example, those who withdraw consent entirely or are found ineligible post hoc. For cluster trials, intention to treat typically means including all eligible individuals in all clusters as allocated. If any clusters merge or drop out, describe how that will be handled.
On to item 27C, handling of missing data. Missing data is common, so pre-specify how you'll deal with it. Will you use imputation? If so, what kind and what assumptions are you making? Multiple imputation is common, for example. We will use multiple imputation by chained equations to handle missing outcome data, assuming data are missing at random. If you use imputation, also state what goes into the imputation model, including treatment group, baseline covariates, the outcome, and key predictors of missingness, along with the number of imputations. If this is a cluster trial or includes repeated measures, Describe how the imputation will account for clustering or within-person correlation. If you're using a simpler approach, say so and justify it. For example, primary analysis will use complete cases, with sensitivity analyses using imputation to assess robustness, and briefly specify the sensitivity strategy. Item 27D covers additional analyses, like subgroup analyses, interaction tests, and sensitivity analyses. If you're planning subgroup analyses, pre-specify them, including the subgroup variables, the rationale, and the statistical approach, ideally using tests of interaction. If you plan to categorize continuous variables, state the cut points and why you chose them. Keep subgroups limited and justified, and treat them as hypothesis-generating, unless strongly supported by prior evidence.
In cluster trials, common subgroups include site type or size. If you want to explore implementation differences, you can consider analyses by fidelity achieved, but frame these clearly as exploratory rather than causal or randomized comparisons.
For sensitivity analyses, mention the rationale and the statistical methods. Sensitivity analyses could include different ways to handle missing data, or maybe different definitions of outcome. For example, including versus excluding certain borderline events. If you have any decisions that are somewhat arbitrary, you might plan to test alternatives. For example, we define adherence as attending equal to or more than 4 sessions. We will also analyze using an equal to or more than 3 sessions threshold as a sensitivity analysis to see if results differ. If you're doing any economic evaluation or cost-effectiveness analysis alongside the trial, consider describing this here with additional details in an appendix or a separate economic evaluation study protocol.
Pragmatic trials also face real-world issues like crossover and contamination. If you plan as treated or per protocol analyses to explore these, state upfront that they are secondary and interpret them cautiously.
Now we move to Spirit Item 28A on trial monitoring. The Data Safety Monitoring Board, or DSMB. In the US, this is often referred to as a Data Monitoring Committee, or DMC. The protocol should state whether a DSMB will be used, and if so, briefly describe its membership, its independence from investigators and funders, and how it will operate. That includes what data it will review, how safety events will be monitored, whether it can recommend continuing, modifying, or stopping the trial, how recommendations will be communicated, and how often it will meet. If details are captured in a separate charter, reference it. If no DSMB is planned, say so explicitly, justify why, and describe the alternative oversight approach, such as periodic steering committee reviews.
Item 28B covers interim analyses and stopping guidelines. State whether interim looks are planned, when they will occur, who will see the results, and what stopping rules apply, for example, for harm or futility. If no interim analyses are planned, say so and justify why.
Item 29 covers trial monitoring, meaning operational oversight across sites. Pragmatic trials often use risk-based central monitoring to conserve resources and minimize disruption to routine care. Describe what you'll do, for example, remote checks for completeness and plausibility, with periodic quality reports to sites. If you are not planning on-site monitoring, say so and justify it. Spirit 2025 also folded auditing into this item, so briefly note whether audits by funders, sponsors, or regulators are anticipated.
We're entering the final stretch. Item 30 covers research ethics approval. The protocol should state the ethical and regulatory standards the trial will follow. For example, Canada's Tri-Council Policy Statement, TCPS2, and confirm that written, dated approval from a qualified research ethics board will be obtained before the trial begins. If applicable, also note any required regulatory approvals, such as Health Canada authorization. For multi-site trials, explain how ethics review will be coordinated across sites. For example, whether you will use a single centralized REB or require approvals from each institution's local REB. If you're using a streamlined process, briefly describe the board of record approach and how site-specific requirements will be handled.
Item 31 covers protocol amendments. This is where you explain how substantive changes to the protocol will be decided, documented, and communicated. The protocol should state who has the authority to approve amendments and how changes will be tracked. It should also describe how amendments will be communicated to key parties, such as research ethics boards, trial registries, regulatory bodies, investigators, and participating sites. In multi-site pragmatic trials, note how sites will be notified and whether retraining will occur when changes affect procedures. Once an amendment is approved, make it clear that the updated version becomes the active protocol and that older versions will be retired to avoid confusion.
Item 32A covers consent or assent. The protocol should clearly describe the consent process, who will approach participants, what information will be provided, and how consent will be documented. If some participants cannot provide informed consent, such as minors or decision-impaired patients, specify how assent will be obtained and how proxy or substitute decision-maker consent will be handled. Some pragmatic trials request a waiver or alteration of consent when risk is minimal, participant rights are protected, and obtaining consent is impracticable. If you're requesting a waiver, state it explicitly and describe safeguards, especially around privacy and confidentiality in routine care settings. Item 32B covers additional consent for ancillary studies. If you plan biobanking, future use of data or specimens, or optional sub-studies like interviews, note that these will require separate additional consent.
Spirit Item 33 covers confidentiality. This section should clearly state what identifiable information will be used, why it's needed, who can access it, and how it will be stored, transferred, and protected. Note compliance with applicable privacy legislation and relevant guidance in TCPS2. If identifiable health information will be accessed or used without direct consent, state that you will seek REB approval for a waiver or alteration of consent. Explain why the study is minimal risk and why obtaining consent is impracticable, and describe safeguards such as secure transfer and storage, role-based access, de-identification where possible, and use of authorized data custodians. If data sharing or future research use is planned, outline how re-identification will be prevented. Finally, specify retention and destruction timelines, and include any additional protections for materials like audio recordings if applicable.
Finally, Item 34 covers ancillary and post-trial care. This is where you state what support participants can expect during and after the trial, especially if they experience harm related to participation. Specify any provisions for continued access to the intervention or follow-up care, and what will happen if a trial-related injury occurs. If no ancillary or post-trial care is planned, say so and briefly justify it, particularly for minimal-risk pragmatic trials embedded in routine care. Also state whether participants will incur any research-related costs, and when appropriate, note that certain expenses, like parking, may be reimbursed.
To close, remember that Spirit also has extensions for specific contexts. For example, Spirit Pro provides guidance when patient-reported outcomes are included. Other guidance is emerging for trials using routinely collected data, and for complex or multi-center trials. So it's worth checking whether a Spirit extension fits your design.
And tell us in the comments, have you used Spirit before? And which item tends to trip your team up the most? Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss upcoming modules.